Imagine standing silent in a stone-walled chamber, torches flickering, the eyes of 100 villagers piercing you with their judgment, all while you stand before a cauldron of boiling water or the looming promise of red-hot iron. Imagine, for a moment, that your guilt or innocence will not be determined by what you say, nor by the evidence collected, but rather by how your flesh fares against fire and water. This, trial by ordeal, was once the path through which fate, justice, and the whims of unseen powers converged, in a world where law was inseparable from superstition and suffering. The medieval era was a crucible of contradictions, a time when the Church's shadow fell across kingdoms, and when rulers strove to maintain order not just through reason, but by invoking divine will. In stone-towered towns and rural hamlets alike, justice was not blind. It stared intently from beneath a tapestry of faith, fear, and the relentless need for control. Laws could be written, certainly, but their interpretation was often subservient to ritual, spectacle, and the elemental forces believed to bridge mortals and the divine. To be accused of theft, heresy, blasphemy, or any disturbance of the fragile social order was to be thrust into the heart of a process engineered to terrify, to awe, and ultimately to decide your fate outside human reason. The trial by fire was among the most feared. Picture the accused, forced to grasp a red-hot iron bar or stride 3 paces over burning embers. The act itself was excruciating, the crowd drawn into the spectacle. Each step, each hiss of seared skin, a public confession of faith or condemnation. If the wounds were judged clean and healed after a prescribed period, then divine favor was assumed. You were innocent. But if infection set in, if the flesh refused to knit, it was a sign. God has revealed your guilt. The logic, twisted yet inescapable, made suffering not a consequence, but a central proof of truth. Even kings and knights might submit to such trials if accused, as the ritual often superseded social rank. Here, every man and woman knelt beneath the same relentless test, their outcomes given weight by clergy and crowned heads alike. Equally harrowing was the ordeal by water. 2 forms dominated, hot water and cold water, each with its own cruel calculus. In the hot variant, the accused plunged a hand or arm into a steaming cauldron, sometimes to fetch a stone from the bottom, the boiling liquid wrapping the limb in agony. The wound was then bound and, days later, inspected for signs of divine intervention. In the cold water ordeal, the symbolism was inverted. Accused witches and heretics were bound and cast into a river or pond. If they sank, innocence was presumed, a merciless irony given the danger of drowning. If they floated, it was assumed that the water, element of purity, had rejected them, marking them guilty before the community. Survival, therefore, was not always a saving grace. These spectacles were not merely punishments, but rituals with deep roots across Europe. From the forests of Saxony to the courts of England, the ordeal marked the intersection of faith and force. Religious authorities, particularly the Church, often sanctioned these trials, even as, over centuries, they began to question and later to withdraw their blessings. The rationale was profound but chilling. Human justice was limited, but God's will could be revealed through the suffering of flesh. To communally witness a trial was to take part in a spiritual act, affirming the boundaries of the sacred and the profane. But what of the power beneath these rituals? Ordeals, for all their declared divine intent, were tools for maintaining control. Communities, especially those on the edge of central authority, depended on them to resolve conflicts that local lords and clerics could not. They served a dual role, dispensing justice and reinforcing the economic and social ties that bound peasants to their rulers. Fines, fees, and the spectacle itself could enrich the coffers of those who presided over them. Moreover, these trials were public events, reminders at once of the danger in defying authority and the instability of truth in a world ruled by fear. Symbolic punishments, too, shaded these proceedings. Imagine the shaven heads, the branding of flesh, the exiling of families, all marks not just of guilt, but of separation from the community's collective identity. Trial by ordeal fed on spectacle, using pain as a form of storytelling, each scar etching new lines in the social fabric. Clerics might wield relics or invoke saints, lending their charisma and authority to the process, making of simple judgment a drama both earthly and divine. Economic pressures often haunted the edges of these practices. Trial by ordeal could be manipulated. Those with wealth or favor might receive lighter wounds, better care, or verdicts favorable to their interests. Meanwhile, the poor were often at the mercy of those who controlled not just the law, but the means of surviving its tests. Indulgences, gifts, and whispered favors sometimes greased the machinery of judgment. The dower of a young woman, the tithes of a farmer, the bribes of a merchant, all might tip the scale of justice, transforming sacred ritual into a currency of survival. Relics and superstitions, themselves repositories of communal memory, became powerful tools. The touch of a saint's bone, a cross, or a chalice supposedly magnified the ordeal's meaning, turning suffering into proof positive of innocence or guilt. Faith was weaponized, made manifest in the burning of flesh or the submergence of bodies, as if God's final word awaited within each drop of blood or gasp of air. Yet, beneath the invocation of heaven, lurked the unspoken reputations of those who held the relics, controlled the spectacle, determined the outcome. There was always tension, the silent war between written laws and the reality of justice. Codes and statutes, meticulously copied in monasteries and courts, were often set aside for the raw immediacy of the ordeal. Where written law faltered, riven by ambiguities, manipulated by powerful interests, ordeal stepped in as a tool both of desperation and desire for certainty. But certainty was a cruel illusion. Victims of these trials risked not only their bodies, but the permanent stain of public shame, the loss of reputation, and the agony of exile, even when declared innocent. Families were torn apart, entire villages divided over the simple question, could suffering reveal the truth? The echoes of these practices ring in our own time. Consider, for a moment, how collective judgment returns in new forms. Public shaming, cancel culture, the viral spectacle of accusation and trial on social media platforms. The faces change, the tools are digital, but the rhythm is familiar. We continue to watch, to judge, to demand pain as proof. Only now, the cauldron of boiling water bubbles behind the screens. A flood of hashtags, a torrent of indignation. Even today, the tension between law and popular justice persists, manipulated through misinformation, emotional appeal, and the relentless need to control the narrative. The specter of fake news and manipulated legal outcomes finds its roots in the same soil. In the medieval trials, truth was not an objective discovery, but a communal performance. Evidence mattered less than endurance, pain, spectacle. Lies and rumors shaped people's fates, and so too now does the power of viral accusation. Justice is fragile, at risk always of being bent to the will of crowds, corrupted by the machinery of those who preside over its rituals. By the late Middle Ages, skepticism grew. The Church, keen to modernize its reputation and assert new forms of moral control, pulled away from the sanctioning of ordeals. Rational inquiry, the slow advance of law codes and legal experts, began to replace spectacles of suffering. But for centuries, the trial by fire and water remained the crucible in which innocence and guilt were decided, leaving behind stories so painful and strange they resist even the passage of centuries. Envision now the deeper layers of this medieval system of terror and spectacle. Picture the great cathedrals where these ordeals sometimes took place. Sacred spaces transformed into theaters of judgment, their hallowed walls echoing with prayers and screams alike. The clergy who presided over these rituals held immense power, serving as both spiritual guides and judges of flesh. They claimed to channel divine will, but their human biases, political allegiances, and personal interests inevitably colored their interpretations. A bishop aligned with a particular lord might see divine favor in the healing of wounds that another might deem suspicious. A priest threatened by accusations of heresy might be especially harsh in his judgment of others facing similar charges. The ritual of the ordeal began long before the moment of physical trial. Days or even weeks of preparation preceded the main event, during which the accused lived in a state of suspended dread. They were often confined, sometimes in churches themselves, subjected to fasting, prayer, and the constant ministrations of clergy who claimed to prepare their souls for divine judgment. This period of waiting was itself a form of torture, designed to break down resistance and elicit confessions before the ordeal itself became necessary. The psychological pressure was immense. Isolated from family and friends, surrounded by those who proclaimed their guilt or innocence would soon be revealed by God Himself. Consider the elaborate ceremonies that surrounded these trials. The ordeal was never a simple test, but a full theatrical production, complete with ritual purification of the instruments, blessing of the elements, and formal invocation of divine presence. The iron would be heated not merely to the required temperature, but with sacred fire, blessed by holy oil and consecrated through prayer. The water, whether hot or cold, would be similarly sanctified, transformed from a mere physical element into a vessel of divine judgment. Incense would fill the air, candles would flicker on altars, and the assembled crowd would participate through responsive prayers and hymns. The very atmosphere was designed to convince all present that they were witnessing not human cruelty, but divine justice in action. The social dynamics surrounding these ordeals reveal the complex power structures of medieval society. Accusations rarely arose randomly, but were often the result of long-simmering disputes, economic competition, personal vendettas, or political maneuvering. A successful merchant might find himself accused of usury or fraud by competitors seeking to eliminate him from the marketplace. A woman who had inherited property might face charges of witchcraft from male relatives eager to claim her assets. Peasants who challenged their lord's authority might be branded as heretics or thieves. The ordeal became a weapon that could be wielded by those with sufficient influence to initiate accusations, while its victims were typically those with the least power to defend themselves. The gendered nature of many ordeals is particularly striking. Women faced accusations of witchcraft, adultery, and heresy at disproportionate rates, and the trials they endured often carried sexual undertones that reflected deeper anxieties about female autonomy and power. The cold water ordeal, in particular, was frequently used against accused witches, its symbolism explicitly connecting female sexuality with supernatural corruption. The binding of women's bodies before immersion in water carried unmistakable echoes of sexual domination and control. Meanwhile, the examination of wounds for signs of healing often required intimate physical inspection, turning the female body into a text to be read by male authorities for signs of divine favor or condemnation. The economic dimensions of these trials extended far beyond simple corruption. The entire system of ordeal was embedded within the broader feudal economy, serving to reinforce property relations and social hierarchies. Accusations of theft, for instance, were rarely about simple material goods, but about challenging the fundamental order of who owned what and who had the right to dispose of property. A serf accused of stealing from his lord was not merely facing punishment for a crime, but was being publicly disciplined for daring to transgress the boundaries that defined his social position. Similarly, accusations of heresy often targeted those whose religious beliefs threatened established power structures, including economic arrangements that benefited the church and nobility at the expense of common people. The role of witnesses in these proceedings deserves particular attention. Unlike modern legal systems, where witnesses testify about facts they have observed, medieval ordeals relied heavily on character witnesses who spoke not about specific events, but about the accused's general reputation and moral standing. This system inevitably favored those who were well connected within their communities while disadvantaging outsiders, immigrants, and social misfits. A person's network of relationships, their standing within local hierarchies, and their ability to cultivate allies all became crucial factors in their survival. The wealthy could purchase positive testimony through gifts and favors, while the poor might find themselves friendless when accusations arose. The intersection of superstition and systematic oppression created a particularly toxic environment for marginalized groups. Jews, Muslims, and other religious minorities faced accusations that drew upon deeply rooted prejudices and conspiracy theories. Foreign merchants and travelers were viewed with suspicion, and might find themselves subjected to ordeals based on nothing more than their unfamiliar customs or appearance. People with physical disabilities or mental illness were often seen as marked by divine disfavor and faced accusations of witchcraft or demonic possession. The ordeal system thus served not only to maintain general social control, but to specifically target and eliminate those who disrupted the homogeneous Christian community that medieval authorities sought to create and maintain. The training and preparation of those who administered ordeals reveals another layer of systematic organization. Priests and other officials did not simply improvise these trials, but followed detailed procedures that had been developed and refined over centuries. Manuals existed that specified exactly how hot the iron should be, how deep into the water a hand should be plunged, how many days should pass before wounds were examined, and what signs should be looked for in determining divine judgment. This bureaucratization of suffering ensured that ordeals maintained their authority through apparent objectivity and consistency, even as their outcomes were shaped by entirely human prejudices and interests. The psychological impact of living under such a system cannot be overstated. Every member of medieval society knew that they might someday find themselves subject to ordeal, and this knowledge shaped behavior in profound ways. People cultivated relationships with powerful patrons who might protect them from accusations. They avoided actions that might be interpreted as suspicious or threatening, and they participated enthusiastically in the persecution of others as a way of demonstrating their own orthodoxy and loyalty. The ordeal system created a climate of mutual surveillance and denunciation that extended its reach far beyond the relatively small number of people who actually faced trials. Simply knowing that such punishments existed was enough to modify the behavior of entire populations. The decline of ordeals did not happen suddenly, but was the result of gradual changes in legal thinking, religious doctrine, and social organization. Canon lawyers began to question whether God could really be compelled to perform miracles on demand, while secular authorities grew frustrated with a system that could not be easily controlled or predicted. The rise of universities and scholastic philosophy provided alternative frameworks for thinking about truth and evidence, while the growth of more complex economic and political systems required legal procedures that could handle increasingly sophisticated disputes. The Fourth Lateran Council, his prohibition on clerical participation in ordeals, was thus not just a religious reform, but part of a broader transformation of medieval society toward more rational and bureaucratic forms of governance. Yet the psychological and cultural legacy of ordeals persisted long after their official abandonment. The belief that suffering could reveal truth, that public spectacle was necessary for justice, and that divine judgment could be invoked through ritual continued to shape legal thinking and popular culture. Witch trials of the early modern period drew heavily upon ordeal traditions, while public executions maintained the theatrical and communal elements that had made ordeals so powerful. Even today, the assumption that truth emerges through adversarial confrontation, that justice requires visible punishment, and that community participation legitimizes legal proceedings all trace their roots back to the medieval courtroom where fire and water determined fate. The stories of individual victims of ordeals, when they can be recovered from historical records, reveal the human cost of this system in heartbreaking detail. Take the case of a young woman accused of adultery who was forced to carry hot iron while pregnant, the trauma causing her to miscarry during the trial itself. Or consider the merchant who survived the cold water ordeal only to find his business destroyed by the suspicion that continued to cling to him despite his supposed vindication. There are accounts of entire families destroyed when one member's conviction led to accusations against relatives and associates, creating cascades of persecution that could devastate entire communities. These individual tragedies remind us that behind the grand historical narratives of legal development and social control were real people who suffered and died in the name of a justice that was neither just nor merciful. The international nature of ordeal practices reveals how deeply embedded these ideas were in medieval European culture. Similar trials can be found from Ireland to Hungary, from Sicily to Scandinavia, suggesting that the appeal of ordeal transcended local customs and political boundaries. Traders and pilgrims carried stories of trials from place to place, while the mobility of clergy ensured that techniques and interpretations spread rapidly across the continent. This geographical scope also meant that accusations could follow people as they moved, with refugees from one ordeal finding themselves subject to similar charges in their new homes. The universality of ordeal practices thus created a continent-wide system of surveillance and control that made escape from persecution nearly impossible. As we peer deeper into this dark mirror of medieval justice, we begin to see not just the specific cruelties of a distant past, but the enduring human capacity for transforming fear into violence, for dressing persecution in the garments of righteousness, for demanding blood as the price of belonging to community. The men and women who administered these ordeals were not monsters, but ordinary people who had convinced themselves that their actions served higher purposes: the maintenance of social order, the preservation of religious truth, the protection of community values. Their certainty, their sincerity, their genuine belief that they were doing God's work makes their actions not less horrifying, but more so because it reminds us how easily any society can slide from justice into brutality, when fear overwhelms reason and spectacle replaces law. So, as we peel back the layers of history, what do we see? We see not just the scars on individual bodies, but the wounds inflicted on collective memory. Each trial by ordeal, each punishment and spectacle forced communities to choose between justice and cruelty, between faith and reason. The lines were never clear. Watchers become judges, became executioners, all bound together in the ancient dance of accusation, spectacle, and suffering. As you listen to these forbidden stories, as you lose yourself in the flicker of ritual and pain, ask yourself, would you have survived the trials which determined fate by fire and water? Or does the shadow of these ancient ordeals still linger, shaping the way you see justice, truth, and mercy in today's world? If you find these stories as haunting and provocative as the ancient manuscripts from which they are drawn, remember to share this journey. Like, comment, and subscribe to join us as we uncover the forbidden justice that history tried to silence. The deeper you dive, the more secrets you will find, and the more you may come to question if fate has truly changed, or if we still judge, punish, and decide as they did centuries ago. The question remains, echoing down the cold corridors of time. Would you emerge innocent, or forever marked by pain and suspicion, under the medieval laws of fire and water?